This is the Fantasy Football Fellowship Podcast presented by Medi-Share. Together, we'll unpack fantasy, faith, and life. I'm Bryce Johnson with Harrison Zuckerberg, and we are your fantasy coaches here on the final edition of the Fantasy Football Fellowship Podcast for the 2022 season. As we recap, we review, we just remember what took place throughout the fantasy season and what lessons we learned, what takeaways we have, where we whiffed and missed, where we hit, the players that did great this year, which players actually won championships for fantasy managers this season, and which players were most disappointing. And so we will unpack all of that today, and hopefully what we've done all season and what we want to, to do today is we want to encourage you. We want to help you find meaning and purpose throughout the fantasy season, and we hope that we helped you win and you were in position to at least get into the playoffs and make a run at a championship. And so as we learned once again, you do your best as a fantasy manager. You make wise decisions. You try to put the right players in your lineup. And then you need a lot of things to just go your way that are out of your control. And, of course, injuries and wild things took place throughout the fantasy playoffs, as they always do. But hopefully we set you up for success this year. And as we always remind you, we're not always right, but we hope we're convincing. And so we hope that was the case this season. We are brought to you by Sugar Creek Coffee. And so we love Sugar Creek Coffee. I've been enjoying it for my morning coffee, and they have a passion for coffee, a love for people. It's handcrafted, it's small batch, it's artisan roasted. And the best part, if you go to sugarcreekcoffee.com, you can use the promo code UNPACK to save some money. But the best part, it's fresh roasted coffee delivered to your door. And so they want you to enjoy, flavorful, fresh coffee, and they deliver it right to your door. So go to sugarcreekcoffee.com, use the promo code UNPACK, and enjoy some Sugar Creek coffee like I do. I know Luke loves it as well. And so we appreciate their support of this show. All right. So let's jump in and say hello to Harrison. The last we talked on this show, it was right before Christmas, and we took a couple weeks off of the show. And actually, Harrison, the fantasy playoffs took place while we were apart, and you also traveled across the world over the last couple of weeks. And so take us into the trip that you went on and how it affected your fantasy outcomes.
So I took an amazing trip to Antarctica during the fantasy playoffs, which I don't know why I thought there would be Wi-Fi or service or anything in Antarctica to still be able to keep touch with fantasy. There was not. There was no life. There was nothing. So I'm just stranded in the middle of, icebergs trying to get a score, not even set my fantasy line, just be able to see what games are going on for about 2 or 3 weeks, got nothing. So I was in the dark for my fantasy playoffs, unable to set my lineup. And in the playoff game, I was in the semifinals, only lost by 4. When I got back, I was able to see that. But the worst part was that I had 2 guys on my bench score 30 points each that I probably would have put in instead of the guys that I did have in the lineup, which would have catapulted me to the championship game. And who knows what happens from there. But that was heartbreaking to see that. But, one fantasy year, making the playoffs, making the championship doesn't really matter when you do, some crazy things, once in a lifetime experience like going to Antarctica. So in the end, it was all worth it, but a little bit disappointing that I wasn't able to claim a championship this year just because I had no access to the fantasy app on my phone.
Wow, what a story. You sacrificed your fantasy championship opportunity for, I guess, love, because you're with your girlfriend's family, and then also an experience of a lifetime. So that's pretty cool. So what was the big highlight then from this trip?
Big highlight from the trip was the wildlife. Saw a lot of penguins, seals, killer whales. Probably the craziest thing, though, is that so there's no humans down there. They're just not afraid at all. Every wildlife will come right up next to you. You can walk right up to it because they have no idea what you are. So there's no reason for them to be afraid of you. So that was pretty crazy. Just, being able to walk up to a penguin or be in a boat and whale comes about 5 feet away from your boat because it's just not intimidated by your presence.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, gosh, I've got a lot more questions, but we'll save those for off air, and people can reach out and ask you questions as well. But cool. Well, glad you made it back, because seems like a risky trip, but you made it back, and of course now the fantasy season is over. We head into the NFL playoffs, which some people continue to play fantasy throughout the NFL playoffs, which is fun. It's fine. I did one little kind of fun thing, but for the most part, the regular season is what it's all about. So that's what we're going to reflect on today. And I want to start first, as we kind of usually begin with some fantasy shenanigans. And so as we really take a look at the entire season and the players that ultimately won championships for people, what are the takeaways as we look at our own rosters? I ended up in a couple Final Fours in my leagues, but overall, I didn't have a real successful season. However, as I look back at a lot of my decisions, most of the players that I felt good about ended up having a good year. In certain circumstances, I just couldn't put it all together. And there's a lot of luck that goes into things, and certain injuries at certain points in the year cost me opportunities to make the playoffs and that kind of thing. But overall, it's like, all right, yeah, I feel pretty good about the principles and the fantasy philosophies that I believe in. At the same time, things are always changing. The NFL is evolving. The offenses are changing at times. And a couple of my big takeaways, which we kind of knew going into the season, but the quarterback and the tight end position heading into the year just had a lot of question marks. And for fantasy managers, how we approach those two positions in the draft, I think made all the difference this year, because the people that valued Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes to go and say, I'm going to go get the best quarterback, I'm going to go get the best tight end, which they have been for the most part over the last 5-6 years, however long Mahomes has been in the league, and Kelce for sure. So those two guys won a ton of leagues, and my philosophy has always been, I love running back to start my drafts. I've been doing that for a long time. But I have to reconsider, because the Mahomes Kelce approach is the way to go. The difference between Kelce and Hockenson, who was the second best tight end this season, Kelce finished with 306 points. TJ Hockenson, the second best tight end, 212. I mean, think about that discrepancy. It's unbelievable. So that's my big takeaway from the season. What about for you, Harrison?
Yeah, I think that's going to be something that's really important going into next year, because not even just Mahomes, but you look at Mahomes, Allen, and Hurts. If you had one of those three guys on your roster, you had such an advantage, because they were putting up 25 plus 30 points every week.
Consistent.
Because you're like, oh, well, I have Kirk Cousins. He's the QB6, but he's scoring 10 points less per game than those top three guys. It's really not the same thing. And tight end especially as well. It was either Kelce or nothing pretty much this year. You had to have him, and he was a monster for you. But I think definitely looking at the running back approach is interesting, because outside of Jonathan Taylor, I mean, we can't really say that a lot of the first round running backs busted. Christian McCaffrey had a good year. Austin Eckler had a good year. Derrick Henry statistically had a solid year. He didn't play in the playoffs, which hurt a lot of people. Josh Jacobs had a great season. Saquon Barkley had a breakout year again, like we thought he was going to. But I feel like if you had one of those top running backs on your team, even though they did what you thought they were going to do, you weren't as happy as the guy that had Justin Jefferson or the guy that had Tyreek Hill loaded up on receivers early, because they were fine. They had a good season for you, but they were never really winning you weeks. I don't remember a lot of, game-winning 40-point performances from star running backs this year. It was a lot of 15 points, 18 points. We were going against a guy who his first-round pick was Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase, and, they're putting up a 35-point game, and there's just no way you can match that firepower. So I think we're going to see a lot more receivers taken in the first round. The last couple of years, it's been 1 or 2 receivers go in the first round. I think we're going to probably see like 5 or 6 maybe, and maybe 4 running backs, receivers overtake running backs. And then I wouldn't be surprised to see a Josh Allen or a Patrick Mahomes go in the first round. We were calling guys crazy for taking Josh Allen in the second round this year. It's like, oh, you got to load up on running backs. You're going to have no depth at these other positions. It doesn't matter. You can find guys off the waiver wire. There's only 32 quarterbacks in the NFL, and 10 of them are really only good for fantasy. So you are not finding a top 5 quarterback off the waiver wire, unless you got Justin Fields, which was, crazy. But it's much easier to build depth as the season goes on at running back instead of a position like quarterback or tight end.
Yeah, no, I have to reevaluate my view of elite wide receivers, because over the last couple of years, some of those guys, Tyreek Hill and Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, started to emerge as first or second round guys, and I let other managers take those wide receivers, and I was going to load up with 2 top running backs that I projected to be great. And I have to reevaluate. I'm one of those guys that has to reconsider. And it will depend on fantasy position and all that. And we'll talk about more of that during the offseason leading up to drafts. But it's definitely, this was a year of elite wide receivers. And if you look at, who won championships this year, AJ Brown won a lot of people leagues, CeeDee Lamb. So how high do those 2 guys go next year? And then, Tyreek Hill was on a lot of rosters. So it's definitely worth considering. The one tight end worth mentioning as well, who it took a while to get going, but George Kittle. People that hung on to George Kittle, somebody that we've liked over the years, he won a lot of leagues for people that were patient with him. The one other thing that I think is interesting when looking at the year that McCaffrey and Barkley had, because a lot of people going into last year's drafts, it was, I don't think I can trust Barkley, or, I've been burned by CMC the last 2 seasons, I'm going to avoid him. But both those guys, man, they had amazing seasons and really carried you in many ways. And so what will our approach be this year with injured guys? So Breece Hall comes to mind. Javonte Williams comes to mind. How will those guys be discounted with the potential of really, emerging? And even a guy like J.K. Dobbins, who has started to show that he's injury prone, yet at the same time, when healthy and out there, he still puts up pretty good numbers. And then same with Cam Akers. And so I think those will be some names that will be very interesting in how we all respond to those guys come draft season. So any other final, just kind of overall thoughts and takeaways from this year?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really interesting with the injuries is, the biggest bust of the season by far was Jonathan Taylor, because he was a guy that was, 101, going to carry you as solid as they get, huge workload, never misses time. And then he got injured. And I think this is now not just a coincidence, but a trend that's starting to emerge. So I looked back at some of the other running backs who had a similar narrative of Jonathan Taylor going into the season, where they received 300 plus carries the year before and were locked in as a first round fantasy pick. Go back to Zeke in 2019, Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry, both in 2020, huge workloads. And then Jonathan Taylor in 2021, all those guys receiving 300 plus carries. The following season, those 4 players who did that 300 carry mark, on average missed 4 games, had almost 90 less total carries, and almost averaged 0.6 yards less per carry. So when they were on the field, they were less efficient too. So maybe we should go against the, logical thinking of, this guy handles a huge workload and didn't get injured. Well, if he handled a huge workload and didn't get injured, he's taken more and more hits than the guys who were able to, take a couple games off, like McCaffrey, who was able to rest all of last year, or Barkley. And looking at guys from this year who now are on that, injury watch going to the next season that are, tanks, and we don't think of them being injury prone. Josh Jacobs, Nick Chubb, and then Derrick Henry again. All guys who had a huge workload this year will probably be at the top of draft boards next year because, they're so reliable. Hold on. Let's actually see if they can break that trend of huge workload running backs actually staying healthy the year after they have their giant workload season.
Yeah, you'd almost have to include Najee Harris, Leonard Fournette to a certain extent, Joe Mixon. I mean, some of those guys you just got to kind of consider. Yeah, those would be nominations for that. Whereas, like I've always said, with Austin Eckler, who is this year's #1 running back, the reason I love him is because he doesn't get a ton of carries. He gets a ton of catches. He gets a ton of touches throughout the game, but he doesn't get pounded and beat up like a lot of these running backs. So I would feel comfortable with Eckler being the #1 running back next year and taking him #1.
And then some guys who may be that Austin Eckler mold moving forward is, Tony Pollard, not getting a ton of carries, but gets the ball in his hands and makes the most of that opportunity. And then we saw Travis Etienne, once he got the workload, he wasn't getting 5 carries a game like a Derrick Henry, but he was getting enough touches with his efficiency to produce at an Eckler-like level. So those are 2 other guys next year where, Eckler may be a little rich if you don't have a top 3 pick for you to get on your team, but ETN, the Jags are going to be an explosive offense. He could definitely fit in that mold. And Tony Pollard, we don't know if he'll stay in Dallas, if he'll move somewhere else, but he's that sort of player where you can build an offense around him and a fantasy team around him without having to get him the ball 350 times in the season.
Absolutely. I love Pollard. So let's go there as far as our best calls and decisions of the year, the players that did what we hoped they would do or even exceeded our expectations, but guys that we were excited about heading into the year. And for me, it was Tony Pollard. And he ends up finishing 7th in total points for running backs, which is remarkable. I also love the season that Brandon Ayuk had. He did benefit from Deebo Samuel being banged up this year. That's another player that will be interesting where he goes in drafts next year. That's fascinating. Well, and kind of go back to last year, taking as many carries that he had. He dealt with the ramifications this season. But Ayuk was a benefit of that. And then also the tight end that I love this year, Pat Freiermuth. He was great. He was consistent. He didn't do the Kelsey numbers, of course, but just very solid. You could count on him. He was probably the most reliable tight end this year. And then also I was in on CMC and Barkley this year, and that benefited me well. And then my favorite is I did draft Trevor Lawrence, and he ended up finishing 16th in total points, all positions, which is, of course, quarterbacks score more points, but still, I got him really late last year in my keeper league. I'm going to be able to keep him, and going into next year, he'll be a top 6-7 quarterback anyway, as far as rankings go, with the potential to even exceed that and get into that upper echelon. He's a former #1 pick, and we're seeing the talent. Of course, led his team to the playoffs. And so anyway, love Trevor Lawrence and excited about what he did this year and what he'll do moving forward. What about for you? Where's the excitement?
Yeah, so the excitement for me was, a guy that I was on really early in the preseason was Isaiah Pacheco. And it took a long time for him to catch on, but when he did, he was great for the Chiefs. Justin Fields, someone who I picked up, week 3 in the fantasy season, and then single-handedly won me games for the rest of the year, being a top 5 quarterback, scoring 45, 50-point games, which was insane to see from him. Chris Olave was another guy that I loved. He was a rookie wide receiver I really wanted to get. Got him on, I think, 3 of my teams. A lot of people were in on Drake London or Treylon Burks, but Olave was my guy. He had a fantastic season. And then Ramondre Stevenson was my pick, like your Pollard, for breakout running back. He had a great year. Didn't trust Damian Harris. He went down. Stevenson took over. Even though the Patriots offense wasn't great, Stevenson became the bell cow there and really showed what he could do in a lead role. So I'd say those are my 4 guys that I was really excited that actually panned out my expectations.
Absolutely. And on the flip side, we'll talk about where we missed and kind of whiffed heading into the year. And for me, I didn't get any Ramondre Stevenson shares this season. So I went in on Damian Harris again, based on how good he was last year. But Stevenson was the guy all season long. And I guess toward the end, he got a little banged up. But he was awesome. So I whiffed on him. You mentioned Pacheco. I whiffed on Jerick McKinnon because he was somebody that I actually really liked early in his career and knew that he was a good running back, but then he got injury prone and was bouncing around from different teams. And I really regret not picking him up because he would have been a guy that was available at certain times this year. And he finished really, really well. So I whiffed on him. And then you mentioned some of the rookie wide receivers. In general, I avoid rookies. I don't. Sometimes they get overvalued in my leagues to where I'm not willing to pay the price for them. But somebody like Kenneth Walker, man, what a season he had when healthy. He was awesome. I did have Damian Pierce in one league and ended up trading him actually at the right time, which worked out. But I wish I would have gotten a couple more of these rookies, and especially the wide receivers, Olave and I think Drake London showed what he can do as well moving forward. Garrett Wilson with the Jets, showed what he's capable of. So I whiffed on some of those guys. Where did you miss?
So I completely whiffed on the Dolphins receivers. I did not think that this offense, offensively, like the passing game was going to be as great as it was. And even when they weren't scoring points, Tyreek Hill was still getting 8 receptions for 120 yards when the Dolphins scored like 13 points in the game. Him and Waddle were great together. And then also I really overlooked veteran wide receivers this year. Amari Cooper, Tyler Lockett, guys who were, going into their 30s, on bad situations, what we thought was bad situations. Turns out that Geno Smith is actually a Pro Bowl level quarterback, better than Russell Wilson somehow. But those were guys that I just got no shares in, never even considered drafting them if they were available in like the 10th round. Didn't matter how late it was. And they both finished as, top 20 receivers this year and had great seasons.
Gosh, yeah. No, I'm with you, man. So that's where we whiffed. And so when we come back from, we're going to do our breakout, and we're going to hear from Harrison a little bit more as a couple other takeaways from the year, some guys that maybe we won't draft next season, some of our the waiver wire pickups of the year, and so we'll have a little fun with that. But each week throughout the season, we always did a breakout in the middle of our show where we take a fantasy concept, a principle or something that takes place in a fantasy season, and then we parallel that to the Bible and to our own lives. And so hopefully you participated in Fantasy Football Fellowship throughout the year within your league, and you were a member. And so be thinking about that for next year as well, fantasyfootballfellowship.com. But today I want to talk about the winners of your league. And hopefully you were that person, and you won after weeks of competition and lineup decisions, and you drafted the right guys and picked up the right players on the waivers and made the right choices for who should start each week. And overall, by the end of it, you were the champion. And that feeling, as I look at my 2 rings in front of me from years past, is a pretty cool feeling, where you win your league, and for the next few months, you get to remind the buddies in your league or family members or coworkers, I was the fantasy champion. And when you win, most people in your league will say, hey, congratulations, hey, way to go, great job, impressive year. When you tell people that you won your fantasy league, they say, hey, good job, congratulations, all that kind of thing. And in some ways you're admired, at least for a little while, by the other members of your league. And when you think about the work that you put into this season, you feel validated. You feel like, all right, I can justify the time, and I feel good about what I accomplished. And it's just kind of a wonderful moment when you win the championship. And here's the deal. In fantasy, we love being validated. We feel like we're in some ways better than other people just because we won this year, right? We're better at fantasy than them, and we sort of get excited about that. But it's also fleeting. It goes away in a couple months. Everybody will start thinking about next season, and everybody will have a fresh opportunity, and it'll be old news. And so that validation sort of disappears quickly. But in life, if we expand this beyond fantasy, we all long for validation and approval and worthiness. And whether it's at our work or serving at church or even in our home, having our gifts and our talents and accomplishments, we want them embraced, and we want to be accepted by others. because it's personally rewarding. And so although these things they're not all bad. It's not all bad. There's something in us that it, enjoys that and appreciates it, and we get affirmed and validated. But all those things are fleeting, and they're not deep. They're not lasting in regards to what matters most. And so when we look at this from a biblical perspective, and we realize that eternal acceptance is what we're ultimately longing for. And it's that acceptance from the creator, the God of the universe, our heavenly Father. And so that's what we ultimately long for. And so we receive that validation, that acceptance when we receive God's free gift of salvation. And the best part is it's not based on anything we do. And so we don't have to validate ourselves or prove that we're worthwhile to receive the gift of grace and salvation through Jesus, through our faith in him. And so, we're validated because we've placed our faith in Jesus and his death and resurrection. And so when we rest in that truth and understand that the God of the universe approves us because we're in Christ, then our need for others' approval and acceptance diminish. And so we can get a attaboy or way to go or congratulations from people, and it's fine, cool, all right, great, thanks. But it's not what we're chasing after. It's not what's most important, because we're resting in what the God of the universe says about us. And so that's what ultimately matters and what lasts. And so Romans 5:1 says, "Therefore, since we have been made right in God's sight by faith, we have peace with God because of what Jesus Christ our Lord has done for us." And so it's all about what Jesus has done. We are validated because we are in Christ when we surrender to him and receive him and receive his grace. And so now we spend the rest of our lives experiencing God's love while we do seek to please him above anyone else. And so it's not to be validated in, because we're secure. We're secure in our eternity. We're secure in who he says we are. And we're a child of God. We're part of his family. We're with him for eternity. We're fully loved by him. And so that's wonderful. So we rest in that. But now we live our lives to please him out of a response to the love and the grace that he's shown us. And so Paul writes in Galatians 1:10, obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. And so we're living life as a follower of Jesus and a servant of his. And so we want to please him. And that's what we're chasing after. And so, God's approval is what truly matters. And so that's our focus. And so when our priority is pleasing God above everyone else and finding our affirmation in him, we show that our hearts are in the right place and we're aligned with him. And we understand where true validation comes from. Not the fleeting validation of a championship, fantasy championship, or any other validation that we feel like is important in life. Oh, I'm validated because I've got all the money, or I've got this accomplishment. Those things they pale in comparison, and they're fleeting in the larger scheme of things. What we really want is security, validation, and that approval that comes from a life of faith in Jesus and resting in him and being a servant, a follower of him. And so 2 Timothy 2:15 reminds us, work hard so you can present yourself to God and receive his approval. Be a good worker, one who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly explains the word of truth. And so today, let's praise God for allowing us to be accepted, welcomed, embraced by him because of Jesus. And so let's allow that life-changing peace to give us all the confidence we need to live a life that's pleasing to him and knowing who we are in him. So that's the good news. That's a wonderful reminder for us today that we got to stop worrying about the approval and the validation of others and finding our worthiness in what the world says or what others say, but our worthiness is found in who Jesus says we are in him and the life that we're now living with him and for him, both now and for eternity. So that's pretty cool. All right, there you go. So that's the final breakout topic for this year. The plan is to have all new content and topics for next season. And so we're excited about that as we head into the off season here at Fantasy Football Fellowship. And so we'd love your feedback and any, just kind of reaction to this season and what you thought of the breakouts and what you thought of this podcast and however else you participated in Fantasy Football Fellowship. We'd love to hear from you. So always open to hearing from you through email, Bryce@unpackingit.com. All right, Harrison, as we continue to reflect on this past season, waiver wires were always a big thing that we talked about, usually following the breakout topic. And so as we look back at sort of the waiver wire pickups of the year, who are some of those players that biggest game-changing moves that guys were able to pick up off of waivers?
Well, you mentioned him before. I think the biggest game-changing one has to be Jerick McKinnon. If you picked him up the week before the playoffs, he gave you 32 points, 34 points, 13, and then 23 points in the 4 weeks of that playoff stretch from week 14 on. I mean, he was probably the number one running back that you could have had in the entire league during that time, and he was on waivers just the week before. So he definitely won you your championship if you had him. And then guys for season-long waiver wire pickups. Talk about Samaje Perine filled in at times this year was great. Justin Fields was someone who, if you got him early, he was your starting quarterback for the rest of the year. And then Cam Akers was a guy where he started out really slow, but then really caught fire towards the end of the season and helped you make that playoff push if you got him. And then my favorite waiver wire pickup was, personally for me, Deion Jackson in week 6, backup running back for the Colts, picked him up for 1 week, scored 30 points, and then didn't do anything for the rest of the season, but he won me my game that week having him on my roster.
That was a huge week, and we thought he would do a little bit more throughout the year, but it just didn't happen, and basically the Colts crumbled after that. There's no doubt about it. The one player for me, so I'm a Panthers fan. I don't like the Falcons, and I just avoid Falcons players. It seeps into my fantasy decisions, and I never picked up Tyler Algier, but he was a great pickup this year. Actually, no, I did. I got him in one league. I had him in one league and was able to play him throughout the season, but he was awesome. He was a rookie running back, and Cordero Patterson still had a great year too. They actually finished right next to each other in the running back standings, and both were very effective and awesome players. But Algier was somebody you could get earlier in the season. So he finished 31st overall running backs, and Patterson was 32. So pretty cool. So 145 points for Algier. So he's someone to keep an eye out for next year as well. And speaking about that, who are you most excited about? We've mentioned a couple of these names, but what players going in? You already know it's January. We'll start talking fantasy drafts in July, but who are you most excited about?
For me at QB, it's Trevor Lawrence. I think he's the obvious breakout candidate after having a fantastic season this year. And a lot of times it's like, oh, well, are they going to add more pieces? There's a lot of other quarterback situations where you don't know, are they going to get an upgrade on the O-line? Are they going to get another receiver? We already know that Trevor Lawrence is getting an upgrade because they have Calvin Ridley, and he's going to be coming back from suspension. People forget how great Calvin Ridley was in Atlanta. I mean, we don't know if he'll be that level because he's had 2 years off from football now, but you're talking about an offense that's getting pretty much better overnight, adding another receiver to that core, which is already great for Trevor Lawrence, and then just more time for them to gel in the offensive system. He's going to have a fantastic year next year. And then the rookie wide receiver this season that I think really went under the radar because, he was injured during the middle of the year was Jahan Dotson. During Jahan Dotson's last 5 games, he was on a 70 reception, 1,100 yard, 10 touchdown pace for the Washington Commanders. He was a fantastic player when he was on the field. He's someone who I think will be going in the middle rounds and could truly break out next season in his second season in the NFL if he's healthy for the whole year. So those are 2 guys that I'm extremely excited about. What about you?
All right, I got a couple guys as well. George Pickens got a lot of hype, Pittsburgh wide receiver during training camp. He lived up to that hype. He didn't necessarily put up huge numbers. And as the season went on, Kenny Pickett became a better quarterback. It appears that he's going to be their guy, at least for next year, and really try to see what they have in Pickett. But I think they've seen enough to give him another year. And so George Pickens, as a rookie wide receiver, flashed. He showed glimpses. He showed us what he's capable of. He's a very talented, athletic wide receiver. And I think with a full season and an off season with Kenny Pickett being the guy and establishing that relationship with George Pickens, I think Pickens takes another step forward. And that offense overall takes another step forward next year. We saw how the Steelers finished really well. And I think Pickens will be a beneficiary of that next year. Also, Justin Herbert. He was not as great as we wanted him to be. He had a down season to his standards or to our hype machine. However, he's awesome. We know he's great. I expect him to be good in the NFL playoffs. And next year, I think you could probably get him at a slight discount. And I will be trying to snag him because he's just so talented. And then the third guy, Darren Waller. So I drafted him this year. He did not help me at all. It was a total whiff on my part. But I'm going to double down. I'm going to go after him next year because as we saw the last week or two, he's really good. Again, it's talent in the long run does win out. And sometimes you have to go back to the well, even when, injuries affect a guy. But like we said at the top, we're looking for tight ends. Where are the tight ends? Hello, any tight ends out there? Darren Waller has shown in the past what he's capable of. They're going to have a new quarterback next year. And so I'm excited about Waller having a bounce back season. So we'll see about that. All right. Last thing, we'll wrap up with this. Who left such a bad taste in your mouth this year that you're not going to draft next year?
All right. First guy for me is Adam Thielen. He's someone who I've loved his entire career, but he just really didn't do anything this season. It always felt like he let me down when he was in my lineup. And Justin Jefferson's the guy there now. TJ Hawkinson's there. I'm not anticipating Thielen to have a great year next year. And then my second guy, who is someone who I tried to convince you to draft last year, and Brandon Cooks. I mean, I've been a fan of his as well, but it's just, I think time has run out for Brandon Cooks. Maybe he can find a spot as a wide receiver too somewhere if he gets traded, but he's just not someone who I want on my team. He was extremely disappointing this season.
Mine is way too easy, but I speak for the entire fantasy community. I will not be drafting Russell Wilson. I promise I'm not drafting Russell Wilson. I absolutely blew it. I took him in like the 6th round this year. Huge mistake. I own it, and it will never be done again. I will never have Russell Wilson on my fantasy team. A few years ago, Ezekiel Elliott entered that realm for me, and he has not been on my team for now a number of years. And so Russell Wilson has joined Zeke Elliott as my never will I draft again players. So there you go. But Harrison, man, it's been a fun season with you here on the Fantasy Football Fellowship podcast. And we thank all of our listeners for being supportive and always appreciate any feedback from you and those that jumped in on the live show throughout the year as well. We appreciate that. And we'll be working on things in the off season and look forward to bringing this back sometime in the summer. And so be sure to follow us on social media. Look for Fantasy Football Fellowship. And if you subscribe to this podcast, you'll see updated episodes when they drop. So be sure to go to fantasyfootballfellowship.com as well. Be on the email list if you aren't already. And Harrison, man, excellent job. Always appreciate your insight and always great going back and forth with you. So enjoyed it and wonderful work.
Yep. Great season, Bryce. Proud to be on the show. Didn't capture a championship this year, but that's what next year's for. Off season is going to be great. Put in a ton of work, and hopefully we'll get some more championships next year. But thank you. It's been a great season. Awesome time going back and forth on some guys that we disagree with. So look forward to next season.
Absolutely, man. Well, next year you're not going to Antarctica. That was a one and done. So we'll keep you in the States for the championship and playoff week. So we'll try to make sure that happens. But for Harrison Zuckerberg, we appreciate him. I'm Bryce Johnson. I'm a fantasy manager who follows Jesus. I believe in the good news that he died on the cross for my sin. He was resurrected, and through faith, I've been saved by his grace. I hope that is true for you as well, and I hope you'll join me as we live life as fantasy managers and sports fans who follow Jesus together. Have a great offseason. Enjoy the NFL playoffs. Make sure you subscribe to the Unpacking It podcast for updated episodes there throughout the entire year. And so we thank you for your support. Thanks to all of our financial supporters and members of Fantasy Football Fellowship. Also, thanks to Sugar Creek Coffee. Be sure to go to sugarcreekcoffee.com. Use that promo code UNPACK. Also, thanks to Medi-Share for being our presenting sponsor once again this year. And you can go to medishare.com/unpackingit if you're looking for an affordable, reliable healthcare option that you can trust. Medishare.com/unpackingit. Talk to you soon. Thanks so much. I'm Bryce. This has been the Fantasy Football Fellowship Podcast presented by Medi-Share.